If you don't star in your own life, who wants to be a bit player in their own life? And you challenge people to do that.
Well, that's what Pinocchio is at the beginning of his adventure, right? Because he has these strings and invisible forces are pulling on him from behind the scenes. And you don't want to be that. And that is what you are unless you're playing this role in your own life.
You've heard me say right now in our country that we've got issues. And on the short list is how it feels like so many people have simply forgotten how to treat one another with dignity and respect, abandoning what it means to be a good neighbor, citizen, and hero in their own life. And what is even more frightening is that we have a generation of many young adults that don't truly understand responsibility, hard work, or real sacrifice. What we need is a lesson on how to restore the values and identity that this country and the Western world were built on. Now, my guest tonight has a few ideas on how to do just that. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a best-selling author, a clinical psychologist whose podcast frequently tops the charts in the education category. His international lecture tour has sold out more than 400 venues. In his new book, Who Wrestle With God, Perceptions of the Divine, Dr. Peterson guides readers through the ancient foundational stories of the Western world. While doing so, he analyzes the biblical accounts of rebellion, sacrifice, suffering, and triumph that stabilize, inspire, and unite us culturally and psychologically. Now, Dr. Peterson, first, congratulations. I'm proud to call you friend, and I'm proud of this book that you've done. And you believe this book can truly change people's lives, and that's a bold statement.
Well, I don't think it's bold if you consider the source of what it's analyzing. I mean, the stories that I'm dealing with in this book have changed individual lives and societies literally for thousands of years. What I'm attempting to do, or doing perhaps, is bringing new life to old tales and making them immediately understandable and practically understandable. But the power of that is in the stories. And as you said in your introduction, to unite us and give us direction psychologically and socially. That is what a story does. Certainly, the story of our own lives does that for us personally, especially if the story is oriented properly. And then the stories that we share, they define our culture, and they do, literally, they are what unite us socially. And so I'm trying to, in this book, I'm explaining that. The most important element of the explanation likely is that a description of the structure that does unite us psychologically and socially and give us direction, that description is a story. That's what a story is. That's why they're so compelling to us and why they're so important.
We both believe in facts, empirical, replicatable studies, evidence-based treatment, and therapies. We're both very dedicated to that. But empirical facts, without a story to put them into context, without a story that people can relate to and wrap their arms around, concepts we don't even remember them. They just kind of evaporate without a story.
That indicates a number of things. It indicates, first, that our memories themselves are structured as stories. And so if you encounter a fact that isn't relevant, that you don't care about, you don't remember it because there's no place to put it. Our memories are structured in a narrative manner, which is why, for example, when someone asks you what you've done during the day, or they ask you to tell you about their life, then you tell a story, because that's how your memory is structured. And then you alluded to this as well, is there's an indefinite number of facts. There's as many facts as there are things or combinations of things. And most of those aren't relevant. We don't care about them. They're not related to our lives or even to each other. The structure that makes a fact important and that relates it to other facts in a meaningful way, that is a story. When you go to a movie and you watch the hero pursue his adventure, what you're seeing through his eyes are the relevant facts of his world. And that's what the story lays out. And so the empiricists, the scientific types, let's say, the pure scientists who believe that we only move through the world in consequence of our knowledge of facts, didn't wrestle with the fact that you have to prioritize. Everything you do is a prioritization. Every directional movement of your eyes is prioritization with regards to what's important. It's all a reflection of the story that you inhabit. And so once you understand that the story is irreplaceable and that you see the world through a story, the only question that emerges is what's the appropriate story? And I analyze that in detail in this book.
Oh, yes, you do. And you've got my mind racing. We have so much to discuss. I don't want to keep the audience out of this. Let's go downstairs and dive into this.
Great.
All right,
Looking
let's do
forward
it.
to it.
Please welcome my friend, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Thank you, thank you. Well, you have some fans in the room.
Well, that's nice. I'm very glad to hear that.
Let's just jump right into this. You've written a book entitled We Who Wrestle With God, Perceptions of the Divine, which we're seeing here. So I always grew up, as I'm sure you had people trying to program you this way. I rejected it. You obviously rejected it. That said science and religion were inextricably oppositional. Just that there was no way to reconcile the scientific model with religion, because faith, you can't come up with an empirical proof of faith, and so they were just seen as you can't reconcile those two. How did you reconcile that supposed conflict?
Well, I would say I'm still doing that. It's a very tricky thing to negotiate, which is why that claim has existed, let's say, for 300 or 400 years. There has been many very significant scientists who rejected that claim. So the greatest developmental psychologist, child psychologist of the 20th century, a man named Jean Piaget, he started to become a developmental psychologist because he wanted to understand how children built their models of the world, because he wanted to understand how we understand things, and he wanted to reconcile the difference between science and religion. Piaget cracked the problem to a great degree. He partly did that by showing that there's a finite number of stable ways that people can interact with one another, that they will continue voluntarily, that improve. So imagine that's a good definition of a friendship. The way to establish a friendship if you're a child is that you play a game with another child. Now, during the game, you have to let the other child take a turn and maybe even have a hand in deciding what the game is going to be. So you both have to want to play, okay? Then you have to play in a way that makes the other person happy to play with you. Okay, if you do that, then they're going to want to play with you repeatedly. Okay, now you have a friend. Okay, so now you see that, and that's a social community. That's like the basis of social community, that friendship. And that's voluntary engagement in a voluntarily chosen game. Now, if it's a really good game and a really good friendship, it improves as you play it, which is what you'd hope for in a marriage. Now, imagine that there's a very small number of ways that you can interact with someone else that's game-like, so you're both playing, so that you want to continue it voluntarily, you'll work for that. That improves across time. And then imagine you have to add to that the fact that you could bring more people into the game. Okay, the description of that game is the aim of the religious enterprise. Right, how do you treat someone else? Well, so here's a religious injunction. You treat other people, including even your enemies perhaps, as if they had the same value as you, assuming that you also have value, right? You're made in the image of God, let's say. You have intrinsic value. Other people do too, and it's equivalent to yours. Well, that's one of the rules for this game. Now, you might say, well, I don't believe that. It's like, okay, try playing a game that doesn't have that as a rule. So your rule might be, I'm going to get what I can take from you, right? That's a psychopathic game. And you can play that game for a short period of time with people and you can get some of what you want, but as soon as people figure out who you are, they run away. This is why Cain, in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain has got this psychopathic element. He ends up as a wanderer in the land of Nod. Okay, he's a wanderer because who wants to play with him? He's bitter and resentful, so he has to wander like a criminal in search of new victims. And he's in the land of Nod. You know, that's where children go when they sleep. Well, If you're unconscious enough that you take advantage of other people, then you're existing in a state of, what would you say, self-induced sleep. Yeah, so he's a criminal wanderer in the land of unconsciousness. It's like, that's the alternative game. No one's going to play that game with you. You're not even going to play the game with yourself for any length of time. Yes. Like the game of power, the reason the game of power is wrong is because it collapses under its own weight as it proceeds. And so there's a very finite number of ways that you can treat people that work. And you might think if you're really good at it, not only are people your friends, but they're lining up to be your friends. And so that's what you do with your kids when you try to teach them to be a good sport instead of winning. Because you're trying to teach them to win the game of having people want to play with them instead of the game of winning this, this particular game.
Whether it's talk of a Nobel Peace Prize or fears of World War III, one thing's certain: uncertainty rules the day. And when the world feels this unstable, your finances are on the line. If Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices could skyrocket just like the 1970s. That triggered inflation, gas shortages, and a weakening dollar. Wall Street's already tense. Goldman Sachs sees sustained recession risk, and JP Morgan warns of a potential oil shock. Add in $36 trillion in national debt, and the financial pressure is real. This isn't hype, it's a wake-up call. The time to act is now. That's why I trust Preserve Gold. When the world turns unstable, smart folks turn to gold and silver. Text Dr. Phil to 50505 to get your free precious metals guide from Preserve Gold. As a bonus, you can get up to $15,000 in free silver with a qualified purchase. So don't wait. Text Dr. Phil to 50505 today. You quote Luke 6:31, then, which everybody knows is the golden rule, which is not sociopathic or psychopathic, and it doesn't exclude competitiveness either.
Definitely not. So it says, what you would want other men to do to you, you should do to them. It's like, well, you hear the unwise, hypothetically hyper-compassionate type saying, we shouldn't have competition in games. It's like, you want competition in your marriage of the right sort. It's like Eve means something like, what would you say, viable contender. The name Eve means worthy adversary in play. That's a good way of thinking about it. Your partner in your marriage, you can think about that as a long-term game, is someone you want to contend with, right? You don't want them to be a pushover. You want them to encourage you in your best. If you're playing a game with someone, pick up basketball one-on-one. You don't want to play with someone you can just demolish. You want to play with someone who's maybe a little better than you, because then you get better as you play. You want that competition built in. And when you say you should treat people like you'd want to treat them, you have to think about, well, how would you want to be treated if you were treated the way that would be best for you? Well, you don't want people to excuse every stupid thing you do. You want people to hold you accountable and to keep you on the straight and narrow and to encourage you when you're doing difficult things. And like, that's that reciprocal love. It's not being nice to other people. It's way more complicated and sophisticated than that. And some of that is that competition.
Sure, it sharpens you.
Definitely, yeah. And you want to be sharp because there's things you're going to have to cut through.
Yeah, because if you're not challenged, if they don't hold you to some standard, you become a slug.
You also have no respect for them.
We who wrestle with God, perceptions of the divine. What I got from this is you're taking those stories and saying, let's look at these differently than what your typical clergy might have used these stories for in the past. I want to relate these in a way that people can use them and say, what does this say to me about what I need to do in this day and time when everything seems to be getting questioned? Everything seems to be challenging the identification of man and society and all. You say, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Let's find some constants. Let's go back and look at what has held across centuries and centuries and see if those lessons hold, and they seem to hold.
Well, one way of contemplating the fact of the biblical stories, let's say, is to understand that those are the stories that have survived for millennia. There's a reason for that. Stories are only remembered insofar as they retain their relevance. Well, those are the stories that have retained their relevance and have compelled people to remember them for, we don't know how many thousands of years. In the oldest stories, it could be 25,000 years. It's a very, very long time. And so what that indicates is that those are the stories that people have been able to return to in times of trouble to stabilize them when everything's up in the air. And that worked successfully, because otherwise the tradition would have been broken, and it hasn't been broken. Now, we live in a time where one of the hallmarks of virtue is the celebration of diversity. Now, the problem with diversity as such is that diversity can mean plenty and it can mean opportunity, but it can also mean confusion and chaos. And so an accidental and careless diversity means the disintegration of everything, including your own psyche, into warring elements. You need a unity, because a unity unites, right? And if you're not united within yourself, then you're a house divided against itself, and a house divided against itself necessarily falls. That's true individually and it's true socially. So in the opening sequence of Genesis, which describes the origin of being, right? The beginning of the world. It describes more than that. It describes how the world was created, is created, and forever will be created. It spans time. And there's an insistence in that text that the word, so the words you use, the word itself, if it is properly spoken, which means to be spoken in alliance with the truth and motivated by what's highest, if you speak in that manner, if you use your words in that manner, then you're part of the process that makes possibility into the order that's good. Now, you know that deeply, because you know that if you operate within your family and you tell your children and your wife or your husband the truth, then if you have the courage to do that, then you have the possibility of setting things straight and establishing a firm foundation. Well, that's part of the manner in which you reflect the image of God. The idea is that human beings are reflections of the image of God. That's what makes us valuable. Well, why? Because we partake in the process of ongoing creation by utilizing our language, for example, in the service of what's good and what's true. And that's right. It's exactly 100% right. Now, part of the reason that you have rights in the United States and Western cultures in general is because we're part of the tradition that insists that every person has that quality. Everyone has something vital to bring into the world that's unique, that the world is less without that contribution. And you make that contribution with your allegiance to the truth. You need to understand that. You can see how that's practically relevant. It's like, well, why tell the truth? Because the world degenerates into chaotic hell if you don't. And that's exactly right. We know, for example, in totalitarian states, which you could think of as the opposite of free and well-constituted Western societies, let's say, in a totalitarian state, everyone lies about everything to themselves and everyone else 100% of the time. And that's why those societies degenerate into hell. And it really is hell. For all intents and purposes, it's hell. And you might think, well, is hell eternal? It's like, if you're in hell, you're going to think it's eternal, at least. I mean, you've been in situations where you've suffered stupidly and pointlessly, and maybe in the consequence of your own foolishness. That's a good definition of hell.
Yeah. By the way, this is what it's like going to dinner with Jordan. That's why he's slim and I'm not. Because while we're at dinner, I'm eating and he's preaching and going on. I don't even remember what I asked him.
You asked me about the relevance of the story, why they're still relevant.
There was something in there. One of the things that people will get out of this book, which is amazing, by the way, the book is great, and you can put it down for a second and walk away, which you'll need to do, because it's very thought-provoking, and it will cause you to really write things down and think about them. But if we think back through our lives, and maybe I'm just boring, but I bet for most people, a lot of our lives are wallpaper. And then there are a number of days that pop out, and stand out against the wallpaper. And those are the stories that we remember. And that's the same way you're talking about here. There are stories that you've identified that have this commonality to them, that this relatability to them, that you think will really challenge people to evaluate where they are and how they're spending their lives. Here you go.
Well, the pop-out idea is dead on the money. So I'll give you an example of how that relates to these biblical stories. There are important times in your life where something of significance has occurred. So we tell stories about the important episodes of our life because they make themselves manifest to us as significant, and they'll capture the interest of other people. So there's something there that matters deeply. That's what happens to Moses in the desert when he encounters the burning bush. So Moses is just going about his business as a shepherd. He's run away from Egypt at that point, despite being an aristocrat, and he's taken on a relatively lowly life, although an adult life, as a shepherd, a guardian of the vulnerable, a protector against predators. It's a hard job being a shepherd. He has to be out on his own, taking care of himself and his flock. He's married and he's got some responsibility, but he's an ordinary person at this point, and he's out in the desert and he's near a mountain because enlightenment occurs near a mountain, and he sees something that glimmers to him and beckons. Okay, this happens to all of us, as you're doing your ordinary things and something captures your attention or your imagination. The question is, what is that? Now, you can ignore that. Maybe you'd ignore that if you wanted to stay with the wallpaper, you want to stay in your rut. Or you could go off the beaten path and you could investigate. And that's what Moses does. And he sees this tree that's burning. That's a symbol of life itself, because a tree is alive. A tree is a symbol of life. And everything alive metabolizes, and that's a kind of flame. And if you see something intensely alive, which is what you see when you see someone you love, let's say, it's on fire. And so that's what Moses sees. He sees deep into the nature of what compels us, and he goes and investigates. As he gets closer, he starts to understand that he's on sacred ground. See, what captures your interest and pulls you out of your rut, that is a manifestation of the sacred. This is by definition. And if you investigate what compels you and calls to you, you go deeper into it. And that's what happens to Moses. He takes off his shoes, and that signifies his willingness to change his identity, because shoes are emblematic of identity, like Cinderella's shoes, for example, or the witch's shoes in The Wizard of Oz. And so he starts to deeply investigate this thing that's called to him, and what happens? The divine itself speaks to him and says, I'm the ground of being that's revealing itself to you. And if you continue this pursuit, you will change by necessity into the leader that you should be. And Moses allows that to happen, despite the fact that he knows he's not a good speaker. He has all sorts of flaws, and God basically says, I don't care about your flaws. You can't use them as an excuse. If you pursue what compels you, it will transform you, and you have to make the best of a bad lot. And that's your responsibility, and you have to figure out how to do that despite your flaws. Moses communes with this calling, this thing that attracts him, that's not wallpaper, that's memorable. And God says, the mere fact that you've had this experience will allow you to speak the words that people will respond to. Because Moses says, well, I'm going to go talk to the Pharaohs and my people, the Israelites. Why are they going to listen to me? And the answer to that is, if you pursue what compels you forward and you discuss it truthfully, people will listen, because you speak then with the voice of authority. And that's the nature of charisma, when it's genuine, when it's not narcissistic and false.